Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. Chapter 51. What purpose I had in view, when I was hot on tracing out and proving Estella's parentage, I cannot say. It will presently be seen that the question was not before me in a distinct shape, until it was put before me by a wiser head than my own. But when Herbert and I had held our momentous conversation, I was seized with a feverish conviction that I ought to hunt the matter down, that I ought not to let it rest, but that I ought to see Mr. Jaggers and come at the bare truth. I really do not know whether I felt that I did this for Estella's sake, or whether I was glad to transfer to the man in whose preservation I was so much concerned, some rays of the romantic interest that had so long surrounded her. Perhaps the latter possibility may be the nearer to the truth. Anyway, I could scarcely be withheld from going out to Gerrard Street that night. Herbert's representations that if I did, I should probably be laid up and stricken useless, when our fugitive's safety would depend upon me, alone restrained my impatience. On the understanding, again and again reiterated, that come what would, I was to go to Mr. Jaggers to-morrow, I at length submitted to keep quiet, and to have my hurts looked after, and to stay at home. Early next morning we went out together, and at the corner of Giltspur Street, by Smithfield, I left Herbert to go his way into the city, and took my way to Little Britain. There were periodical occasions when Mr. Jaggers and Wemmick went over the office accounts, and checked off the vouchers, and put all things straight. On these occasions Wemmick took his books and papers into Mr. Jaggers's room, and one of the upstairs clerks came down into the outer office. Finding such a clerk on Wemmick's post that morning, I knew what was going on. But I was not sorry to have Mr. Jaggers and Wemmick together, as Wemmick would then hear for himself that I said nothing to compromise him. My appearance with my arm bandaged and my coat loose over my shoulders favoured my object. Although I had sent Mr. Jaggers a brief account of the accident as soon as I had arrived in town, yet I had to give him all the details now, and the speciality of the occasion caused our talk to be less dry and hard, and less strictly regulated by the rules of evidence than it had been before. While I described the disaster, Mr. Jaggers stood, according to his wont, before the fire. Wemmick leaned back in his chair, staring at me, with his hands in the pockets of his trousers, and his pen put horizontally into the post. The two brutal casts, always inseparable in my mind from the official proceedings, seemed to be congestively considering whether they didn't smell fire at the present moment. My narrative finished, and their questions exhausted, I then produced Miss Havisham's authority to receive the £900 for Herbert. Mr. Jaggers's eyes retired a little deeper into his head when I handed him the tablets, but he presently handed them over to Wemmick, with instructions to draw the cheque for his signature. While that was in course of being done, I looked on at Wemmick as he wrote, and Mr. Jaggers, poising and swaying himself on his well-polished boots, looked on at me. "I am sorry, Pip," said he, as I put the cheque in my pocket when he had signed it, "that we do nothing for you." "Miss Havisham was good enough to ask me," I returned, "whether she could do nothing for me, and I told her no." "Everybody should know his own business," said Mr. Jaggers, and I saw Wemmick's lips form the words, "portable property." "I should not have told her no, if I had been you," said Mr. Jaggers, "but every man ought to know his own business best." "Every man's business," said Wemmick, rather reproachfully towards me, "is portable property." As I thought the time was now come for pursuing the theme I had at heart, I said, turning on Mr. Jaggers, "I did ask something of Miss Havisham, however, sir. I asked her to give me some information relative to her adopted daughter, and she gave me all she possessed." "Did she?" said Mr. Jaggers, bending forward to look at his boots, and then straightening himself. "Ha! I don't think I should have done so, if I had been Miss Havisham, but she ought to know her own business best. I know more of the history of Miss Havisham's adopted child than Miss Havisham herself does, sir. I know her mother." Mr. Jaggers looked at me inquiringly, and repeated, "Mother?" "I have seen her mother within these 3 days." "Yes?" said Mr. Jaggers. "And so have you, sir. And you have seen her still more recently." "Yes?" said Mr. Jaggers. "Perhaps I know more of Estella's history than even you do," said I. "I know her father, too." A certain stop that Mr. Jaggers came to in his manner. He was too self-possessed to change his manner, but he could not help its being brought to an indefinably attentive stop, assured me that he did not know who her father was. This I had strongly suspected from Provis's account, as Herbert had repeated it, of his having kept himself dark, which I pieced on to the fact that he himself was not Mr. Jaggers's client until some 4 years later, and when he could have no reason for claiming his identity. But I could not be sure of this unconsciousness on Mr. Jaggers's part before, though I was quite sure of it now. "So, you know the young lady's father, Pip?" said Mr. Jaggers. "Yes," I replied. "And his name is Provis, from New South Wales." Even Mr. Jaggers started when I said those words. It was the slightest start that could escape a man, the most carefully repressed and the soonest checked, but he did start, though he made it a part of the action of taking out his pocket-handkerchief. How Wemmick received the announcement, I am unable to say, for I was afraid to look at him just then, lest Mr. Jaggers's sharpness should detect that there had been some communication unknown to him between us. "And on what evidence, Pip?" asked Mr. Jaggers, very coolly, as he paused with his handkerchief half-way to his nose. "Does Provis make this claim?" "He does not make it," said I, "and has never made it, and has no knowledge or belief that his daughter is in existence." For once, the powerful pocket-handkerchief failed. My reply was so unexpected that Mr. Jaggers put the handkerchief back into his pocket without completing the usual performance, folded his arms, and looked with stern attention at me, though with an immovable face. Then I told him all I knew, and how I knew it, with the one reservation that I left him to infer that I knew from Miss Havisham what I in fact knew from Wemmick. I was very careful indeed as to that. Nor did I look towards Wemmick until I had finished all I had to tell, and had been for some time silently meeting Mr. Jaggers's look. When I did at last turn my eyes in Wemmick's direction, I found that he had unposted his pen, and was intent upon the table before him. "Ha!" said Mr. Jaggers at last, as he moved towards the papers on the table. "What item was it you were at, Wemmick, when Mr. Pip came in?" But I could not submit to be thrown off in that way, and I made a passionate, almost an indignant appeal to him to be more frank and manly with me. I reminded him of the false hopes into which I had lapsed, the length of time they had lasted, and the discovery I had made, and I hinted at the danger that weighed upon my spirits. I represented myself as being surely worthy of some little confidence from him, in return for the confidence I had just now imparted. I said that I did not blame him, or suspect him, or mistrust him, but I wanted assurance of the truth from him. And if he asked me why I wanted it, and why I thought I had any right to it, I would tell him, little as he cared for such poor dreams, that I had loved Estella dearly and long, and that although I had lost her, and must live a bereaved life, whatever concerned her was still nearer and dearer to me than anything else in the world. And seeing that Mr. Jaggers stood quite still and silent, and apparently quite obdurate under this appeal, I turned to Wemmick and said, "Wemmick, I know you to be a man with a gentle heart. I have seen your pleasant home, and your old father, and all the innocent, cheerful, playful ways with which you refresh your business life, and I entreat you to say a word for me to Mr. Jaggers, and to represent to him that, all circumstances considered, he ought to be more open with me." I have never seen two men look more oddly at one another than Mr. Jaggers and Wemmick did, after this apostrophe. At first, a misgiving crossed me that Wemmick would be instantly dismissed from his employment; but it melted as I saw Mr. Jaggers relax into something like a smile, and Wemmick become bolder. "What's all this?" said Mr. Jaggers. "You with an old father, and you with pleasant and playful ways?" "Well," returned Wemmick, "if I don't bring 'em here, what does it matter?" "Pip," said Mr. Jaggers, laying his hand upon my arm, and smiling openly, "this man must be the most cunning impostor in all London." "Not a bit of it," returned Wemmick, growing bolder and bolder. "I think you're another." Again they exchanged their former odd looks, each apparently still distrustful that the other was taking him in. "You with a pleasant home?" said Mr. Jaggers. "Since it don't interfere with business," returned Wemmick, "let it be so. Now, I look at you, sir. I shouldn't wonder if you might be planning and contriving to have a pleasant home of your own one of these days, when you're tired of all this work." Mr. Jaggers nodded his head retrospectively 2 or 3 times, and actually drew a sigh. "Pip," said he, "we won't talk about poor dreams. You know more about such things than I, having much fresher experience of that kind. But now, about this other matter. I'll put a case to you. Mind, I admit nothing." He waited for me to declare that I quite understood that he expressly said that he admitted nothing. "Now, Pip," said Mr. Jaggers, "put this case. Put the case that a woman, under such circumstances as you have mentioned, held her child concealed, and was obliged to communicate the fact to her legal adviser, on his representing to her that he must know, with an eye to the latitude of his defence, how the fact stood about that child. Put the case that at the same time he held a trust to find a child for an eccentric rich lady to adopt and bring up." "I follow you, sir." "Put the case that he lived in an atmosphere of evil, and that all he saw of children was, their being generated in great numbers for certain destruction. Put the case that he often saw children solemnly tried at a criminal bar, where they were held up to be seen. Put the case that he habitually knew of their being imprisoned, whipped, transported, neglected, cast out, qualified in all ways for the hangman, and growing up to be hanged. Put the case that pretty nigh all the children he saw in his daily business life, he had reason to look upon as so much spawn, to develop into the fish that were to come to his net, to be prosecuted, defended, forsworn, made orphans, bedevilled somehow." "I follow you, sir." "Put the case, Pip, that here was one pretty little child out of the heap, who could be saved, whom the father believed dead, and dared make no stir about, as to whom, over the mother, the legal adviser had this power. I know what you did, and how you did it. You came so and so. This was your manner of attack, and this the manner of resistance. You went so and so. You did such and such things to divert suspicion. I have tracked you through it all, and I tell you it all. Part with the child, unless it should be necessary to produce it to clear you, and then it shall be produced. Give the child into my hands, and I will do my best to bring you off. If you are saved, your child is saved too. If you are lost, your child is still saved. Put the case that this was done, and that the woman was cleared." "I understand you perfectly." "But that I make no admissions?" "That you make no admissions." And Wemmick repeated, "No admissions." "Put the case, Pip, that passion and the terror of death had a little shaken the woman's intellect, and that when she was set at liberty, she was scared out of the ways of the world,
and went to him to be sheltered. Put the case that he took her in, and that he kept down the old wild violent nature whenever he saw an inkling of its breaking out, by asserting his power over her in the old way. Do you comprehend the imaginary case?
Quite.
Put the case that the child grew up and was married for money, that the mother was still living, that the father was still living, that the mother and father, unknown to one another, were dwelling within so many miles, furlongs, yards, if you like, of one another, that the secret was still a secret, except that you had got wind of it. Put that last case to yourself very carefully.
I do.
I ask Wemmick to put it to himself very carefully.
And Wemmick said, I do.
For whose sake would you reveal the secret? For the father's? I think he would not be much the better for the mother. For the mother's? I think if she had done such a deed, she would be safer where she was. For the daughter's? I think it would hardly serve her to establish her parentage for the information of her husband, and to drag her back to disgrace after an escape of 20 years, pretty secure to last for life. But add the case that you had loved her, Pip, and had made her the subject of those poor dreams, which have, at one time or another, been in the heads of more men than you think likely, and I tell you that you had better, and would much sooner, when you had thought well of it, chop off that bandaged left hand of yours with your bandaged right hand, and then pass the chopper on to Wemmick there, to cut that off too.
I looked at Wemmick, whose face was very grave. He gravely touched his lips with his forefinger. I did the same. Mr. Jaggers did the same.
Now, Wemmick, said the latter, then resuming his usual manner, what item was it you were at when Mr. Pip came in?
Standing by for a little while they were at work, I observed that the odd looks they had cast at one another were repeated several times, with this difference now, that each of them seemed suspicious, not to say conscious, of having shown himself in a weak and unprofessional light to the other. For this reason, I suppose they were now inflexible with one another, Mr. Jaggers being highly dictatorial, and Wemmick obstinately justifying himself whenever there was the smallest point in abeyance for a moment. I had never seen them on such ill terms, but generally they got on very well indeed together. But they were both happily relieved by the opportune appearance of Mike, the client with the fur cap, and the habit of wiping his nose on his sleeve, whom I had seen on the very first day of my appearance within those walls. This individual, who, either in his own person, or in that of some member of his family, seemed to be always in trouble, which in that place meant Newgate, called to announce that his eldest daughter was taken up on suspicion of shoplifting. As he imparted this melancholy circumstance to Wemmick, Mr. Jaggers, standing magisterially before the fire, and taking no share in the proceedings, Mike's eye happened to twinkle with the tear.
"What are you about?"
demanded Wemmick, with the utmost indignation.
"What do you come snivelling here for?"
"I didn't go to do it, Mr. Wemmick."
"You did," said Wemmick.
"How dare you?
"You're not in a fit state to come here. If you can't come here without spluttering like a bad pen, what do you mean by it?"
"A man can't help his feelings, Mr. Wemmick,"
pleaded Mike.
"His what?"
demanded Wemmick, quite savagely.
"Say that again." "Now, look here, my man," said Mr. Jaggers, advancing a step, and pointing to the door. "Get out of this office. I'll have no feelings here. Get out." "He serves you right," said Wemmick. "Get out."
So, the unfortunate Mike very humbly withdrew, and Mr. Jaggers and Wemmick, appeared to have re-established their good understanding, and went to work again with an air of refreshment upon them, as if they had just had lunch. Chapter 51. Chapter 52. From Little Britain, I went with my cheque in my pocket to Miss Skiffins' brother, the accountant, and Miss Skiffins' brother, the accountant, going straight to Clarriker's, and bringing Clarriker to me, I had the great satisfaction of concluding that arrangement. It was the only good thing I had done, and the only completed thing I had done, since I was first apprised of my great expectations. Clarriker informing me on that occasion that the affairs of the house were steadily progressing, that he would now be able to establish a small branch house in the East, which was much wanted for the extension of the business, and that Herbert, in his new partnership capacity, would go out and take charge of it. I found that I must have prepared for a separation from my friend, even though my own affairs had been more settled. And now, indeed, I felt as if my last anchor were loosening its hold, and I should soon be driving with the winds and waves. But there was recompense in the joy with which Herbert would come home of a night and tell me of these changes, little imagining that he told me no news, and would sketch airy pictures of himself conducting Clara Barley to the land of the Arabian Nights, and of me going out to join them, with a caravan of camels, I believe, and of our all going up the Nile and seeing wonders. Without being sanguine as to my part in these bright plans, I felt that Herbert's way was clearing fast, and that old Bill Barley had but to stick to his pepper and rum, and his daughter would soon be happily provided for. We had now got into the month of March. My left arm, though it presented no bad symptoms, took in the natural course so long to heal that I was still unable to get a coat on. My right arm was tolerably restored, disfigured, but fairly serviceable. On a Monday morning, when Herbert and I were at breakfast, I received the following letter from Wemmick by the post. Walworth. Burn this as soon as read. Early in the week, or say Wednesday, you might do what you know of, if you felt disposed to try it. Now burn. When I had shown this to Herbert, and had put it in the fire, but not before we had both got it by heart, we considered what to do. For, of course, my being disabled could now be no longer kept out of view. "I have thought it over, again and again," said Herbert, "and I think I know a better course than taking a Thames waterman. Take Startop, a good fellow, a skilled hand, fond of us, and enthusiastic and honourable." I had thought of him more than once. "But how much would you tell him, Herbert?" "It is necessary to tell him very little. Let him suppose it a mere freak, but a secret one, until the morning comes. Then let him know that there is urgent reason for your getting Provis aboard and away. You go with him?" "No doubt." "Where?" It had seemed to me, in the many anxious considerations I had given the point, almost indifferent what port we made for. Hamburg, Rotterdam, Antwerp. The place signified little, so that he was got out of England. Any foreign steamer that fell in our way, and would take us up, would do. I had always proposed to myself to get him well down the river in the boat, certainly well beyond Gravesend, which was a critical place for search or inquiry if suspicion were afoot. As foreign steamers would leave London at about the time of high water, our plan would be to get down the river by a previous ebb tide, and lie by in some quiet spot until we could pull off to one. The time when one would be due where we lay, wherever that might be, could be calculated pretty nearly if we made inquiries beforehand. Herbert assented to all this, and we went out immediately after breakfast to pursue our investigations. We found that a steamer for Hamburg was likely to suit our purpose best, and we directed our thoughts chiefly to that vessel. But we noted down what other foreign steamers would leave London with the same tide, and we satisfied ourselves that we knew the build and colour of each. We then separated for a few hours, I to get at once such passports as were necessary, Herbert to see Startup at his lodgings. We both did what we had to do without any hindrance, and when we met again at 1 o'clock, reported it done. I, for my part, was prepared with passports. Herbert had seen Start-up, and he was more than ready to join. Those two should pull a pair of oars, we settled, and I would steer. Our charge would be sitter, and keep quiet. As speed was not our object, we should make way enough. We arranged that Herbert should not come home to dinner before going to Mill Pond Bank that evening, that he should not go there at all tomorrow evening, Tuesday, that he should prepare Provis to come down to some stairs hard by the house on Wednesday, when he saw us approach, and not sooner, that all the arrangements with him should be concluded that Monday night, and that he should be communicated with no more in any way until we took him on board. These proportions, well understood by both of us, I went home. On opening the outer door of our chambers with my key, I found a letter in the box, directed to me. A very dirty letter, though not ill-written. It had been delivered by hand, of course, since I left home, and its contents were these: "If you are not afraid to come to the Old Marshes to-night, or to-morrow night at 9, and to come to the little sluice-house by the lime-kiln, you had better come. If you want information regarding your Uncle Provis, you had much better come and tell no one, and lose no time. You must come alone. Bring this with you." I had had load enough upon my mind before the receipt of this strange letter. What to do now I could not tell, and the worst was that I must decide quickly, or I should miss the afternoon coach, which would take me down in time for to-night. To-morrow night I could not think of going, for it would be too close upon the time of the flight. And again, for anything I knew, the proffered information might have some important bearing on the flight itself. If I had had ample time for consideration, I believe I should still have gone. Having hardly any time for consideration, my watch showing me that the coach started within half an hour, I resolved to go. I should certainly not have gone, but for the reference to my Uncle Provis, that, coming on Wemmick's letter and the morning's busy preparation, turned the scale. It is so difficult to become clearly possessed of the contents of almost any letter in a violent hurry, that I had to read this mysterious epistle again, twice, before its injunction to me to be secret got mechanically into my mind. Yielding to it in the same mechanical kind of way, I left a note in pencil for Herbert, telling him that as I should be soon going away, I knew not for how long, I had decided to hurry down and back, to ascertain for myself how Miss Havisham was faring. I had then barely time to get my great-coat, lock up the chambers, and make for the coach-office by the short by-ways. If I had taken a hackney chariot and gone by the streets, I should have missed my aim. Going as I did, I caught the coach just as it came out of the yard. I was the only inside passenger, jolting away knee-deep in straw, when I came to myself. For I really had not been myself since the receipt of the letter. It had so bewildered me, ensuing on the hurry of the morning. The morning hurry and flutter had been great, for, long and anxiously as I had waited for Wemmick, his hint had come like a surprise at last. And now I began to wonder at myself for being in the coach, and to doubt whether I had sufficient reason for being there, and to consider whether I should get out presently and go back, and to argue against ever heeding an anonymous communication, and, in short, to pass through all those phases of contradiction and indecision to which I suppose very few hurried people are strangers. Still, the reference to Provis by name mastered everything. I reasoned, as I had reasoned already, without knowing it, if that be reasoning. In case any harm should befall him through my not going, how could I ever forgive myself? It was dark before we got down, and the journey seemed long and dreary to me, who could see little of it inside, and who could not go outside in my disabled state. Avoiding the Blue Boar, I put up at an inn of minor reputation down the town, and ordered some dinner. While it was preparing, I went to Sartor's house, and inquired for Miss Havisham. She was still very ill, though considered something better. My inn had once been a part of an ancient ecclesiastical house, and I dined in a little octagonal common room, like a font. As I was not able to cut my dinner, the old landlord with the shining bald head, did it for me. This bringing us into conversation, he was so good as to entertain me with my own story, of course with the popular feature that Pumblechook was my earliest benefactor and the founder of my fortunes. "Do you know the young man?" said I. "Know him?" repeated the landlord. "Ever since he was no height at all." "Does he ever come back to this neighbourhood?" "Aye, he comes back," said the landlord, "to his great friends now and again, and gives the cold shoulder to the man that made him." "What man is that?" "Him that I speak of," said the landlord. "Mr. Pumblechook." "Is he ungrateful to no one else?" "No doubt he would be, if he could," returned the landlord. "But he can't. And why? Because Pumblechook done everything for him." "Does Pumblechook say so?" "Say so!" replied the landlord. "He han't no call to say so." "But does he say so?" "It would turn a man's blood to white wine vinegar to hear him tell of it, sir," said the landlord. I thought, "Yet, Joe, dear Joe, you never tell of it. Long-suffering and loving Joe, you never complain. Nor you, sweet-tempered Biddy." "Your appetite's been touched like by your accident," said the landlord, glancing at the bandaged arm under my coat. "Try a tenderer bit." "No, thank you," I replied, turning from the table to brood over the fire. "I can eat no more. Please take it away." I had never been struck at so keenly for my thanklessness to Joe, as to the brazen impostor Pumblechook. The falser he, the truer Joe; the meaner he, the nobler Joe. My heart was deeply and most deservedly humbled, as I mused over the fire for an hour or more. The striking of the clock aroused me, but not from my dejection or remorse, and I got up and had my coat fastened round my neck, and went out. I had previously sought in my pockets for the letter that I might refer to it again, but I could not find it, and was uneasy to think that it must have been dropped in the straw of the coach. I knew very well, however, that the appointed place was the little sluice-house by the lime-kiln on the marshes, and the hour 9. Towards the marshes I now went straight, having no time to spare. Chapter 52. Chapter 53. It was a dark night, though the full moon rose as I left the enclosed lands, and passed out upon the marshes. Beyond their dark line, there was a ribbon of clear sky, hardly broad enough to hold the red large moon. In a few minutes she had ascended out of that clear field, in among the piled mountains of cloud. There was a melancholy wind, and the marshes were very dismal. A stranger would have found them insupportable, and even to me they were so oppressive that I hesitated, half inclined to go back. But I knew them well, and could have found my way on a far darker night, and had no excuse for returning, being there. So, having come there against my inclination, I went on against it. The direction that I took was not that in which my old home lay, nor that in which we had pursued the convicts. My back was turned towards the distant hulks as I walked on, and, though I could see the old lights away on the spits of sand, I saw them over my shoulder. I knew the lime-kiln as well as I knew the old battery, but they were miles apart, so that if a light had been burning at each point that night, there would have been a long strip of the blank horizon between the two bright specks. At first I had to shut some gates after me, and now and then to stand still, while the cattle that were lying in the banked-up pathway arose and blundered down among the grass and reeds. But after a little while, I seemed to have the whole flats to myself. It was another half-hour before I drew near to the kiln. The lime was burning with a sluggish, stifling smell, but the fires were made up and left, and no workmen were visible. Hard by was a small stone quarry. It lay directly in my way, and had been worked that day, as I saw by the tools and barrows that were lying about. Coming up again to the marsh level of this excavation, for the rude path lay through it, I saw a light in the old sluice-house. I quickened my pace, and knocked at the door with my hand. Waiting for some reply, I looked about me, noticing how the sluice was abandoned and broken, and how the house, of wood with a tiled roof, would not be proof against the weather much longer, if it were so even now, and how the mud and ooze were coated with lime, and how the choking vapour of the kiln crept in a ghostly way towards me. Still there was no answer, and I knocked again. No answer still, and I tried the latch. It rose under my hand, and the door yielded. Looking in, I saw a lighted candle on a table, a bench, and a mattress on a truckle bedstead. As there was a loft above, I called, "Is there any one here?" But no voice answered. Then I looked at my watch, and finding that it was past 9, called again, "Is there any one here?" There being still no answer, I went out at the door, irresolute what to do. It was beginning to rain fast. Seeing nothing save what I had seen already, I turned back into the house, and stood just within the shelter of the doorway, looking out into the night. While I was considering that some one must have been there lately, and must soon be coming back, or the candle would not be burning, it came into my head to look if the wick were long. I turned round to do so, and had taken up the candle in my hand, when it was extinguished by some violent shock, and the next thing I comprehended was, that I had been caught in a strong running noose, thrown over my head from behind. "Now," said a suppressed voice, with an oath, "I've got you."
What is this?"
I cried, struggling.
"Who is it? Help! Help! Help!"
Not only were my arms pulled close to my sides, but the pressure on my bad arm caused me exquisite pain. Sometimes a strong man's hand, sometimes a strong man's breast, was set against my mouth to deaden my cries, and with a hot breath always close to me, I struggled ineffectually in the dark, while I was fastened tight to the wall.
"And now,"
said the suppressed voice with another oath,
"call out again, and I'll make short work of you."
Faint and sick with the pain of my injured arm, bewildered by the surprise, and yet conscious how easily this threat could be put in execution, I desisted, and tried to ease my arm were it ever so little. But it was bound too tight for that. I felt as if, having been burnt before, it were now being boiled. The sudden exclusion of the night, and the substitution of black darkness in its place, warned me that the man had closed a shutter. After groping about a little, he found the flint and steel he wanted, and began to strike a light. I strained my sight upon the sparks that fell among the tinder, and upon which he breathed and breathed, match in hand, but I could only see his lips, and the blue point of the match, even those but fitfully. The tinder was damp, no wonder there, and one after another the sparks died out. The man was in no hurry, and struck again with the flint and steel. As the sparks fell thick and bright about him, I could see his hands, and touches of his face, and could make out that he was seated and bending over the table, but nothing more. Presently I saw his blue lips again, breathing on the tinder, and then a flare of light flashed up, and showed me Orlick. Whom I had looked for, I don't know. I had not looked for him. Seeing him, I felt that I was in a dangerous strait indeed, and I kept my eyes upon him. He lighted the candle from the flaring match with great deliberation, and dropped the match, and trod it out. Then he put the candle away from him on the table, so that he could see me, and sat with his arms folded on the table, and looked at me. I made out that I was fastened to a stout perpendicular ladder a few inches from the wall, a fixture there, the means of ascent to the loft above.
"Now,"
said he, when we had surveyed one another for some time,
I've got you."
"Unbind me. Let me go."
"Ah,"
he returned.
"I'll let you go. I'll let you go to the moon. I'll let you go to the stars. All in good time."
"Why have you lured me here?"
"Don't you know?"
said he, with a deadly look. "Why have you set upon me in the dark?"
"Because I mean to do it all myself. One keeps a secret better than two. Oh, you enemy, you enemy!"
His enjoyment of the spectacle I furnished, as he sat with his arms folded on the table, shaking his head at me, and hugging himself, had a malignity in it that made me tremble. As I watched him in silence, he put his hand into the corner at his side, and took up a gun with a brass-bound stock.
"Do you know this?"
said he, making as if he would take aim at me.
"Do you know where you saw it afore? Speak, Wolf."
"Yes," I answered.
"You cost me that place, you did. Speak."
"What else could I do?"
"You did that, and that would be enough without more. How dared you come betwixt me and a young woman I liked?"
"When did I?"
"When didn't you? It was you as always give old Orlick a bad name to her."
"You gave it to yourself. You gained it for yourself. I could have done you no harm, if you had done yourself none."
"You're a liar, and you'll take any pains, and spend any money, to drive me out of this country, will you?"
said he, repeating my words to Biddy in the last interview I had with her.
"Now, I'll tell you a piece of information. It was never so well worth your while to get me out of this country as it is to-night. Ah, if it was all your money 20 times told, to the last brass farden."
As he shook his heavy hand at me, with his mouth snarling like a tiger's, I felt that it was true. "What are you going to do to me?"
"I'm a-going,"
said he, bringing his fist down upon the table with a heavy blow, and rising as the blow fell, to give it greater force.
"I'm a-going to have your life."
He leaned forward, staring at me, slowly unclenched his hand, and drew it across his mouth, as if his mouth watered for me, and sat down again.
"You was always an old Orlick's way, since ever you was a child. You goes out of his way this present night. He'll have no more on you. You're dead."
I felt that I had come to the brink of my grave. For a moment I looked wildly round my trap for any chance of escape, but there was none.
"More than that,"
said he, folding his arms on the table again,
"I won't have a rag of you, I won't have a bone of you, left on earth. I'll put your body in the kiln. I'd carry 2 such to it on my shoulders, and, let people suppose what they may of you, they shall never know nothing."
My mind, with inconceivable rapidity, followed out all the consequences of such a death. Estella's father would believe I had deserted him, would be taken, would die accusing me. Even Herbert would doubt me, when he compared the letter I had left for him, with the fact that I had called at Miss Havisham's gate for only a moment. Joe and Biddy would never know how sorry I had been that night. None would ever know what I had suffered, how true I had meant to be, what an agony I had passed through. The death close before me was terrible, but far more terrible than death was the dread of being misremembered after death. And so quick were my thoughts that I saw myself despised by unborn generations, Estella's children, and their children, while the wretch's words were yet on his lips.
"Now, Wolf," said he, "afore I kill you like any other beast, which is what I mean to do, and what I have tied you up for, I'll have a good look at you, and a good goad at you. Oh, you enemy!"
It had passed through my thoughts to cry out for help again, though few could know better than I the solitary nature of the spot, and the hopelessness of aid. But as he sat gloating over me, I was supported by a scornful detestation of him that sealed my lips. Above all things, I resolved that I would not entreat him, and that I would die making some last poor resistance to him. Softened as my thoughts of all the rest of men were, in that dire extremity, humbly beseeching pardon, as I did, of heaven, melted at heart as I was, by the thought that I had taken no farewell, and never, never now could take farewell, of those who were dear to me, or could explain myself to them, or ask for their compassion on my miserable errors. Still, if I could have killed him, even in dying, I would have done it. He had been drinking, and his eyes were red and bloodshot. Around his neck was slung a tin bottle, as I had often seen his meat and drink slung about him in other days. He brought the bottle to his lips, and took a fiery drink from it, and I smelt the strong spirits that I saw flash into his face. "Wolf," said he, folding his arms again, "old Orlick's a-going to tell you somethink. It was you as did for your shrew sister." Again my mind, with its former inconceivable rapidity, had exhausted the whole subject of the attack upon my sister, her illness, and her death, before his slow and hesitating speech had formed these words. "It was you, villain," said I.
"I tell you, it was your doing. I tell you it was done through you," he retorted, catching up the gun, and making a blow with the stock at the vacant air between us. "I come upon her from behind, as I come upon you to-night. I give it her. I left her for dead, and if there had been a lime kiln as nigh her, as there is now nigh you, she shouldn't have come to life again. But it warn't old Orlick as did it. It was you. You was favoured, and he was bullied and beat. Old Orlick, bullied and beat, eh? Now you pays for it. You done it. Now you pays for it." He drank again, and became more ferocious. I saw by his tilting of the bottle that there was no great quantity left in it. I distinctly understood that he was working himself up with its contents to make an end of me. I knew that every drop it held was a drop of my life. I knew that when I was changed into a part of the vapour that had crept towards me but a little while before, like my own warning ghost, he would do as he had done in my sister's case, make all haste to the town, and be seen slouching about there, drinking at the ale-houses. My rapid mind pursued him to the town, made a picture of the street with him in it, and contrasted its lights and life with the lonely marsh and the white vapour creeping over it, into which I should have dissolved. It was not only that I could have summed up years and years and years while he said a dozen words, but that what he did say presented pictures to me, and not mere words. In the excited and exalted state of my brain, I could not think of a place without seeing it, or of persons without seeing them. It is impossible to overstate the vividness of these images, and yet I was so intent, all the time, upon him himself, who would not be intent on the tiger crouching to spring, that I knew of the slightest action of his fingers. When he had drunk this second time, he rose from the bench on which he sat, and pushed the table aside. Then he took up the candle, and shading it with his murderous hand, so as to throw its light on me, stood before me, looking at me, and enjoying the sight. "Wolf, I'll tell you something more. It was old Orlick as you tumbled over on your stairs that night." I saw the staircase with its extinguished lamps. I saw the shadows of the heavy stair-rails thrown by the watchman's lantern on the wall. I saw the rooms that I was never to see again, here a door half open, there a door closed, all the articles of furniture around. "And why was old Orlick there? I'll tell you something more, Wolf. You and her have pretty well hunted me out of this country, so far as getting a easy living in it goes, and I took up with new companions and new masters. Some of them writes my letters when I wants 'em wrote. Do you mind? Writes my letters, Wolf. They writes 50 hands. They're not like sneaking you, as writes but one. I've had a firm mind, and a firm will, to have your life since you was down here at your sister's burying. I han't seen a way to get you safe, and I've looked arter you to know your ins and outs. For, says old Orlick to himself, somehow or another, I'll have him. What? When I looks for you, I finds your Uncle Provis, eh?
Mill Pond Bank, and Chinks's Basin, and the old green copper rope-walk, all so clear and plain. Provis in his rooms, the signal whose use was over. Pretty Clara, the good motherly woman, old Bill Barley on his back, all drifting by, as on the swift stream of my life fast running out to sea.
You with a uncle too? Why, I knowed you at Gargery's when you was so small a wolf that I could have took your weazen betwixt this finger and thumb and chucked you away dead, as I'd thought o' doing odd times when I see you loitering amongst the pollards on a Sunday. And you hadn't found no uncles then. No, not you. But when old Orlick come for to hear that your Uncle Provis had most like wore the leg iron what old Orlick had picked up, filed asunder on these meshes ever so many years ago, and what he kept by him till he dropped your sister with it, like a bullock, as he means to drop you. Hey? When he come for to hear that, hey?"
In his savage taunting, he flared the candle so close at me that I turned my face aside to save it from the flame. "Ha ha!" he cried, laughing after doing it again.
"The burnt child dreads the fire. Old Orlick knowed you was burnt. Old Orlick knowed you were smuggling your Uncle Provis away. Old Orlick's a match for you, and knowed you'd come to-night. Now I'll tell you something more, Wolf, and this ends it. There's them that's as good a match for your Uncle Provis as old Orlick has been for you. Let him wear them when he's lost his nevy. Let him wear them when no man can't find a rag of his dear relation's clothes, nor yet a bone of his body. There's them that can't, and that won't, have Magwitch. Yes, I know the name. Alive in the same land with them, and that's had such sure information of him when he was alive in another land, as that he couldn't and shouldn't leave it unbeknown and put them in danger. Perhaps it's them that writes 50 hands, and that's not like sneaking you as writes but one. Where, Compayson, Magwitch, and the gallows?"
He flared the candle at me again, smoking my face and hair, and for an instant blinding me, and turned his powerful back as he replaced the light on the table. I had thought a prayer, and had been with Joe and Biddy and Herbert, before he turned towards me again. There was a clear space of a few feet between the table and the opposite wall. Within this space he now slouched backwards and forwards. His great strength seemed to sit stronger upon him than ever before, as he did this with his hands hanging loose and heavy at his sides, and with his eyes scowling at me. I had no grain of hope left. Wild as my inward hurry was, and wonderful the force of the pictures that rushed by me instead of thoughts, I could yet clearly understand that unless he had resolved that I was within a few moments of surely perishing out of all human knowledge, he would never have told me what he had told. Of a sudden, he stopped, took the cork out of his bottle, and tossed it away. Light as it was, I heard it fall like a plummet. He swallowed slowly, tilting up the bottle by little and little, and now he looked at me no more. The last few drops of liquor he poured into the palm of his hand, and licked up. Then, with a sudden hurry of violence, and swearing horribly, he threw the bottle from him, and stooped, and I saw in his hand a stone hammer with a long heavy handle. The resolution I had made did not desert me, for, without uttering one vain word of appeal to him, I shouted out with all my might, and struggled with all my might. It was only my head and my legs that I could move, but to that extent I struggled with all the force, until then unknown, that was within me. In the same instant I heard responsive shouts, saw figures and a gleam of light dash in at the door, heard voices in tumult, and saw Orlick emerge from a struggle of men, as if it were tumbling water, clear the table at a leap, and fly out into the night. After a blank, I found that I was lying unbound, on the floor, in the same place, with my head on someone's knee. My eyes were fixed on the ladder against the wall, when I came to myself, had opened on it before my mind saw it, and thus, as I recovered consciousness, I knew that I was in the place where I had lost it. Too indifferent at first, even to look round and ascertain who supported me, I was lying looking at the ladder, when there came between me and it a face, the face of Trabb's boy.
"I think he's all right,"
said Trabb's boy, in a sober voice,
"but ain't he just pale, though?"
At these words, the face of him who supported me looked over into mine, and I saw my supporter to be Herbert. Great Heaven!
"Softly,"
said Herbert.
"gently, Handel. Don't be too eager."
"And our old comrade Startup?" I cried, as he too bent over me. "Remember what he is going to assist us in," said Herbert, "and be calm." The illusion made me spring up, though I dropped again from the pain in my arm. "The time has not gone by, Herbert, has it? What night is it to-night? How long have I been here?" For I had a strange and strong misgiving that I had been lying there a long time, a day and a night, 2 days and nights more. "The time has not gone by. It is still Monday night." "Thank God!" "And you have all to-morrow, Tuesday, to rest in," said Herbert. "But you can't help groaning, my dear Handel. What hurt have you got? Can you stand?" "Yes, yes," said I. "I can walk. I have no hurt but in this throbbing arm." They laid it bare, and did what they could. It was violently swollen and inflamed, and I could scarcely endure to have it touched. But they tore up their handkerchiefs, to make fresh bandages, and carefully replaced it in the sling, until we could get to the town, and obtain some cooling lotion to put upon it. In a little while, we had shut the door of the dark and empty sluice-house, and were passing through the quarry on our way back. Trabb's boy, Trabb's overgrown young man now, went before us with a lantern, which was the light I had seen come in at the door. But the moon was a good 2 hours higher than when I had last seen the sky, and the night, though rainy, was much lighter. The white vapour of the kiln was passing from us as we went by, and, as I had thought a prayer before, I thought a thanksgiving now. Entreating Herbert to tell me how he had come to my rescue, which at first he had flatly refused to do, but had insisted on my remaining quiet, I learnt that I had in my hurry dropped the letter open in our chambers, where he, coming home to bring with him Startup, whom he had met in the street on his way to me, found it very soon after I was gone. Its tone made him uneasy, and the more so because of the inconsistency between it and the hasty letter I had left for him. His uneasiness increasing instead of subsiding, after a quarter of an hour's consideration, he set off for the coach-office with Startup, who volunteered his company, to make inquiry when the next coach went down. Finding that the afternoon coach was gone, and finding that his uneasiness grew into positive alarm as obstacles came in his way, he resolved to follow in a post-chaise. So, he and Startup arrived at the Blue Boar, fully expecting there to find me, or tidings of me, but, finding neither, went on to Miss Havisham's, where they lost me. Hereupon they went back to the hotel, doubtless at about the time when I was hearing the popular local version of my own story, to refresh themselves, and to get someone to guide them out upon the marshes. Among the loungers under the Boar's archway happened to be Trabb's boy, true to his ancient habit of happening to be everywhere where he had no business, and Trabb's boy had seen me passing from Miss Havisham's in the direction of my dining-place. Thus Trabb's boy became their guide, and with him they went out to the sluice-house, though by the town way to the marshes, which I had avoided. Now, as they went along, Herbert reflected that I might, after all, have been brought there on some genuine and serviceable errand, tending to Provis's safety, and, bethinking himself that in that case interruption must be mischievous, left his guide and start-up on the edge of the quarry, and went on by himself, and stole round the house 2 or 3 times, endeavouring to ascertain whether all was right within. As he could hear nothing but indistinct sounds of one deep rough voice, this was while my mind was so busy, he even at last began to doubt whether I was there, when suddenly I cried out loudly, and he answered the cries and rushed in, closely followed by the other 2. When I told Herbert what had passed within the house, he was for our immediately going before a magistrate in the town, late at night as it was, and getting out a warrant. But I had already considered that such a course, by detaining us there, or binding us to come back, might be fatal to Provis. There was no gainsaying this difficulty, and we relinquished all thoughts of pursuing Orlick at that time. For the present, under the circumstances, we deemed it prudent to make rather light of the matter to Trabb's boy, who, I am convinced, would have been much affected by disappointment if he had known that his intervention saved me from the lime-kiln. Not that Trabb's boy was of a malignant nature, but that he had too much spare vivacity, and it was in his constitution to want variety and excitement at anybody's expense. When we parted, I presented him with 2 guineas, which seemed to meet his views, and told him that I was very sorry ever to have had an ill opinion of him, which made no impression on him at all. Wednesday being so close upon us, we determined to go back to London that night, 3 in the post-chaise, the rather as we should then be clear away before the night's adventure began to be talked of. Herbert got a large bottle of stuff for my arm, and by dint of having this stuff dropped over it all the night through, I was just able to bear its pain on the journey. It was daylight when we reached the Temple, and I went at once to bed, and lay in bed all day. My terror, as I lay there, of falling ill and being unfitted for tomorrow, was so besetting that I wonder it did not disable me of itself. It would have done so, pretty surely, in conjunction with the mental wear and tear I had suffered, but for the unnatural strain upon me that tomorrow was. So anxiously looked forward to, charged with such consequences, its result so impenetrably hidden, though so near. No precaution could have been more obvious than our refraining from communication with him that day, yet this again increased my restlessness. I started at every footstep and every sound, believing that he was discovered and taken, and this was the messenger to tell me so. I persuaded myself that I knew he was taken, that there was something more upon my mind than a fear or a presentiment, that the fact had occurred, and I had a mysterious knowledge of it. As the day wore on, and no ill news came, as the day closed in and darkness fell, my overshadowing dread of being disabled by illness before tomorrow morning altogether mastered me. My burning arm throbbed, and my burning head throbbed, and I fancied I was beginning to wander. I counted up to high numbers, to make sure of myself, and repeated passages that I knew in prose and verse. It happened sometimes that in the mere escape of a fatigued mind, I dozed for some moments or forgot. Then I would say to myself with a start, "Now it has come. I am turning delirious." They kept me very quiet all day, and kept my arm constantly dressed, and gave me cooling drinks. Whenever I fell asleep, I awoke with the notion I had had in the sluice-house, that a long time had elapsed, and the opportunity to save him was gone. About midnight I got out of bed and went to Herbert, with the conviction that I had been asleep for 24 hours, and that Wednesday was past. It was the last self-exhausting effort of my fretfulness, for after that I slept soundly. Wednesday morning was dawning when I looked out of window. The winking lights upon the bridges were already pale. The coming sun was like a marsh of fire on the horizon. The river, still dark and mysterious, was spanned by bridges that were turning coldly grey, with here and there at top a warm touch from the burning in the sky. As I looked along the clustered roofs, with church towers and spires shooting into the unusually clear air, the sun rose up, and a veil seemed to be drawn from the river, and millions of sparkles burst out upon its waters. From me, too, a veil seemed to be drawn, and I felt strong and well. Herbert lay asleep in his bed, and our old fellow student lay asleep on the sofa. I could not dress myself without help, but I made up the fire, which was still burning, and got some coffee ready for them. In good time, they too started up strong and well, and we admitted the sharp morning air at the windows, and looked at the tide that was still flowing towards us. "When it turns at 9 o'clock," said Herbert cheerfully, "look out for us, and stand ready, you over there at Mill Pond Bank." Chapter 53. Chapter 54. It was one of those March days, when the sun shines hot and the wind blows cold, when it is summer in the light and winter in the shade. We had our pea-coats with us, and I took a bag. Of all my worldly possessions, I took no more than the few necessaries that filled the bag. Where I might go, what I might do, or when I might return, were questions utterly unknown to me, nor did I vex my mind with them, for it was wholly set on Provis's safety. I only wondered for the passing moment, as I stopped at the door and looked back, under what altered circumstances I should next see those rooms, if ever. We loitered down to the Temple stairs, and stood loitering there, as if we were not quite decided to go upon the water at all. Of course I had taken care that the boat should be ready, and everything in order. After a little show of indecision, which there were none to see, but the 2 or 3 amphibious creatures belonging to our Temple stairs, we went on board, and cast off. Herbert in the bow, I steering. It was then about high water, 8:30. Our plan was this. The tide beginning to run down at 9, and being with us until 3, we intended still to creep on after it had turned, and row against it until dark. We should then be well in those long reaches below Gravesend, between Kent and Essex, where the river is broad and solitary, where the waterside inhabitants are very few, and where lone public houses are scattered here and there, of which we could choose one for a resting place. There we meant to lie by all night. The steamer for Hamburg and the steamer for Rotterdam would start from London at about 9 on Thursday morning. We should know at what time to expect them, according to where we were, and would hail the first, so that if by any accident we were not taken aboard, we should have another chance. We knew the distinguishing marks of each vessel. The relief of being at last engaged in the execution of the purpose was so great to me, that I felt it difficult to realize the condition in which I had been a few hours before. The crisp air, the sunlight, the movement on the river, and the moving river itself, the road that ran with us, seeming to sympathize with us, animate us, and encourage us on, freshened me with new hope. I felt mortified to be of so little use in the boat, but there were few better oarsmen than my 2 friends, and they rowed with a steady stroke that was to last all day. At that time, the steam traffic on the Thames was far below its present extent, and watermen's boats were far more numerous. Of barges, sailing colliers, and coasting traders, there were perhaps as many as now, but of steamships, great and small, not a tithe or a 20th part so many. Early as it was, there were plenty of scullers going here and there that morning, and plenty of barges dropping down with the tide. The navigation of the river between bridges in an open boat was a much easier and commoner matter in those days than it is in these, and we went ahead among many skiffs and wherries, briskly. Old London Bridge was soon passed, and old Billingsgate Market with its oyster boats and Dutchmen, and the White Tower and Traitor's Gate, and we were in among the tiers of shipping. Here were the Leith, Aberdeen, and Glasgow steamers, loading and unloading goods, and looking immensely high out of the water as we passed alongside. Here were colliers by the score and score, with the coal-whippers plunging off stages on deck as counterweights to measures of coal swinging up, which were then rattled over the side into barges. Here, at her moorings, was tomorrow's steamer for Rotterdam, of which we took good notice, and here tomorrow's for Hamburg, under whose bowsprit we crossed. And now, I, sitting in the stern, could see with a faster beating heart Mill Pond Bank and Mill Pond Stairs. "Is he there?" said Herbert. "Not yet." "Right. He was not to come down till he saw us. Can you see his signal?" "Not well from here, but I think I see it. Now I see him. Pull both. Easy, Herbert. Oars." We touched the stairs lightly for a single moment, and he was on board, and we were off again. He had a boat cloak with him, and a black canvas bag, and he looked as like a river pilot as my heart could have wished.
"Dear boy,"
he said, putting his arm on my shoulder as he took his seat.
"Faithful dear boy. Well done. Thank'ee, thank'ee."
Again among the tiers of shipping, in and out, avoiding rusty chain cables, frayed hempen hawsers, and bobbing buoys, sinking for the moment, floating broken baskets, scattering floating chips of wood and shaving, cleaving floating scum of coal, in and out, under the figurehead of the John of Sunderland, making a speech to the winds, as is done by many Johns, and the Betsy of Yarmouth, with a firm formality of bosom, and her knobby eyes starting 2 inches out of her head, in and out, hammers going in shipbuilders' yards, saws going at timber, clashing engines going at things unknown, pumps going in leaky ships, capstans going, ships going out to sea, and unintelligible sea creatures roaring curses over the bulwarks at respondent lightermen, in and out at last upon the clearer river, where the ship's boys might take their fenders in, no longer fishing in troubled waters with him over the side, and where the festooned sails might fly out to the wind. At the stairs, where we had taken him aboard, and ever since, I had looked warily for any token of our being suspected. I had seen none. We certainly had not been, and at that time as certainly we were not, either attended or followed by any boat. If we had been waited on by any boat, I should have run in to shore, and have obliged her to go on, or to make her purpose evident. But we held our own, without any appearance of molestation. He had his boat cloak on him, and looked, as I have said, a natural part of the scene. It was remarkable, but perhaps the wretched life he had led accounted for it, that he was the least anxious of any of us. He was not indifferent, for he told me that he hoped to live to see his gentleman one of the best of gentlemen in a foreign country. He was not disposed to be passive or resigned, as I understood it, but he had no notion of meeting danger half-way. When it came upon him, he confronted it, but it must come before he troubled himself.
"If you knowed, dear boy," he said to me, "what it is to sit here, alonger my dear boy, and have my smoke, arter having been day by day betwixt 4 walls, you'd envy me. But you don't know what it is."
"I think I know the delights of freedom," I answered.
"Ah,"
said he, shaking his head gravely,
"but you don't know it equal to me. You must have been under lock and key, dear boy, to know it equal to me. But I ain't a-going to be low."
It occurred to me as inconsistent, that for any mastering idea he should have endangered his freedom and even his life. But I reflected that perhaps freedom without danger was too much apart from all the habit of his existence to be to him what it would be to another man. I was not far out, since he said, after smoking a little,
"You see, dear boy, when I was over yonder, t'other side the world, I was always a-looking to this side, and it come flat to be there, for all I was a-growing rich. Everybody knowed Magwitch, and Magwitch could come, and Magwitch could go, and nobody's head would be troubled about him. They ain't so easy concerning me here, dear boy. Wouldn't be, leastwise, if they knowed where I was."
"If all goes well," said I, "you will be perfectly free and safe again within a few hours."
"Well," he returned, drawing a long breath, "I hope so."
"And think so?" He dipped his hand in the water over the boat's gunwale, and said, smiling with that softened air upon him which was not new to me,
I suppose I think so, dear boy. We'd be puzzled to be more quiet and easy-going than we are at present, but it's a-flowing so soft and pleasant through the water, perhaps as makes me think it. I was a-thinking through my smoke just then, that we can no more see the bottom of the next few hours than we can see to the bottom of this river what I catches hold of. Nor yet we can't no more hold their tide than I can hold this, and it's run through my fingers and gone, you see,"
holding up his dripping hand. "But your face, I should think you were a little despondent," said I.
"Not a bit on it, dear boy. It comes a-flowing on so quiet, and of that there rippling at the boat's head, making a sort of a Sunday tune. Maybe I'm growing a trifle old, besides."
He put his pipe back in his mouth with an undisturbed expression of face, and sat as composed and contented as if we were already out of England. Yet he was as submissive to a word of advice as if he had been in constant terror. For, when we ran ashore to get some bottles of beer into the boat, and he was stepping out, I hinted that I thought he would be safest where he was, and he said,
"Do you, dear boy?"
and quietly sat down again. The air felt cold upon the river, but it was a bright day, and the sunshine was very cheering. The tide ran strong. I took care to lose none of it, and our steady stroke carried us on thoroughly well. By imperceptible degrees, as the tide ran out, we lost more and more of the nearer woods and hills, and dropped lower and lower between the muddy banks, but the tide was yet with us when we were off Gravesend. As our charge was wrapped in his cloak, I purposely passed within a boat or two's length of the floating custom-house, and so out to catch the stream, alongside of two emigrant ships, and under the bows of a large transport with troops on the forecastle looking down at us. And soon the tide began to slacken, and the craft lying at anchor to swing, and presently they had all swung round, and the ships that were taking advantage of the new tide to get up to the pool began to crowd upon us in a fleet, and we kept under the shore, as much out of the strength of the tide now as we could, standing carefully off from low shallows and mud banks. Our oarsman was so fresh, by dint of having occasionally let her drive with the tide for a minute or two, that a quarter of an hour's rest proved full as much as they wanted. We got ashore among some slippery stones while we ate and drank what we had with us, and looked about. It was like my own marsh country, flat and monotonous, and with a dim horizon, while the winding river turned and turned, and the great floating buoys upon it turned and turned, and everything else seemed stranded and still. For now, the last of the fleet of ships was round the last low point we had headed, and the last green barge, straw-laden, with a brown sail, had followed, and some ballast lighters, shaped like a child's first rude imitation of a boat, lay low in the mud, and a little squat shoal lighthouse on open piles stood crippled in the mud on stilts and crutches, and slimy stakes stuck out of the mud, and slimy stones stuck out of the mud, and red landmarks and tide marks stuck out of the mud, and an old landing stage and an old roofless building slipped into the mud, and all about us was stagnation and mud. We pushed off again, and made what way we could. It was much harder work now, but Herbert and Startup persevered, and rowed, and rowed, and rowed, until the sun went down. By that time the river had lifted us a little, so that we could see above the bank. There was the red sun on the low level of the shore in a purple haze, fast deepening into black, and there was the solitary flat marsh, and far away there were the rising grounds, between which and us there seemed to be no life, save here and there in the foreground a melancholy gull. As the night was fast falling, and as the moon, being past the full, would not rise early, we held a little council, a short one, for clearly our course was to lie by at the first lonely tavern we could find. So they plied their oars once more, and I looked out for anything like a house. Thus we held on, speaking little, for 4 or 5 dull miles. It was very cold, and a collier coming by us, with her galley fire smoking and flaring, looked like a comfortable home. The night was as dark by this time as it would be until morning, and what light we had seemed to come more from the river than the sky, as the oars in their dipping struck at a few reflected stars. At this dismal time we were evidently all possessed by the idea that we were followed. As the tide made, it flapped heavily at irregular intervals against the shore, and whenever such a sound came, one or other of us was sure to start and look in that direction. Here and there, the set of the current had worn down the bank into a little creek, and we were all suspicious of such places, and eyed them nervously. Sometimes, "What was that ripple?" one of us would say in a low voice, or another, "Is that a boat yonder?" And afterwards we would fall into a dead silence, and I would sit impatiently thinking with what an unusual amount of noise the oars worked in the thowels. At length we descried a light and a roof, and presently afterwards ran alongside a little causeway made of stones that had been picked up hard by. Leaving the rest in the boat, I stepped ashore, and found the light to be in a window of a public house. It was a dirty place enough, and I dare say not unknown to smuggling adventurers, but there was a good fire in the kitchen, and there were eggs and bacon to eat, and various liquors to drink. Also, there were 2 double-bedded rooms. "Such as they were," the landlord said. No other company was in the house than the landlord, his wife, and a grizzled male creature, the Jack of the little causeway, who was as slimy and smeary as if he had been low-water mark too. With this assistant I went down to the boat again, and we all came ashore, and brought out the oars and rudder and boat-hook and all else, and hauled her up for the night. We made a very good meal by the kitchen fire, and then apportioned the bedrooms. Herbert and Startop were to accompany one, I and our charge the other. We found the air as carefully excluded from both, as if air were fatal to life, and there were more dirty clothes and bandboxes under the beds than I should have thought the family possessed. But we considered ourselves well off, notwithstanding, for a more solitary place we could not have found. While we were comforting ourselves by the fire after our meal, the Jack, who was sitting in a corner, and who had a bloated pair of shoes on, which he had exhibited while we were eating our eggs and bacon, as interesting relics that he had taken a few days ago from the feet of a drowned seaman washed ashore, asked me if we had seen a 4-oared galley going up with the tide. When I told him no, he said she must have gone down then, and yet she took up too, when she left there.
"They must have thought better on't for some reason or another," said the Jack, "and gone down."
"A 4-oared galley, did you say?" said I.
"A 4," said the Jack, "and 2 sitters."
"Did they come ashore here?"
"They put in with a stone 2-gallon jar for some beer. I'd have been glad to poison the beer myself," said the Jack, "or put some rattling physic in it."
"Why?"
"I know why,"
said the Jack. He spoke in a slushy voice, as if much mud had washed into his throat.
"He thinks,"
said the landlord, a weakly meditative man with a pale eye, who seemed to rely greatly on his Jack,
"he thinks they was what they wasn't. I knows what I thinks," observed the Jack. "You thinks Custom House, Jack," said the landlord. "I do," said the Jack. "Then you're wrong, Jack." "Am I?"
In the infinite meaning of his reply, and his boundless confidence in his views, the Jack took one of his bloated shoes off, looked into it, knocked a few stones out of it on the kitchen floor, and put it on again. He did this with the air of a Jack who was so right that he could afford to do anything.
"Why, what do you make out that they done with their buttons then, Jack?"
asked the landlord, vacillating weakly.
"Done with their buttons?"
returned the Jack.
"Chucked 'em overboard, swallowed 'em, sold 'em to come up small salad. Done with their buttons." "Don't be cheeky, Jack," remonstrated the landlord, in a melancholy and pathetic way. "A custom house officer knows what to do with his buttons,"
said the Jack, repeating the obnoxious word with the greatest contempt.
"When they comes betwixt him and his own light, a 4 and 2 sitters don't go hanging and hovering, up with one tide and down with another, and both with and against another, without there being Custom House at the bottom of it."
Saying which, he went out in disdain, and the landlord, having no one to reply upon, found it impracticable to pursue the subject. This dialogue made us all uneasy, and me very uneasy. A dismal wind was muttering round the house, the tide was flapping at the shore, and I had a feeling that we were caged and threatened. A 4-oared galley, hovering about in so unusual a way as to attract this notice, was an ugly circumstance that I could not get rid of. When I had induced Provis to go up to bed, I went outside with my 2 companions. Startup, by this time, knew the state of the case, and held another council. Whether we should remain at the house until near the steamer's time, which would be about 1 in the afternoon, or whether we should put off early in the morning, was the question we discussed. On the whole, we deemed it the better course to lie where we were, until within an hour or so of the steamer's time, and then get out in her track and drift easily with the tide. Having settled to do this, we returned into the house and went to bed. I lay down with the greater part of my clothes on, and slept well for a few hours. When I awoke, the wind had risen, and the sign of the house, the ship, was creaking and banging about, with noises that startled me. Rising softly, for my charge lay fast asleep, I looked out of the window. It commanded the causeway where we had hauled up our boat, and, as my eyes adapted themselves to the light of the clouded moon, I saw 2 men looking into her. They passed by under the window, looking at nothing else, and they did not go down to the landing place, which I could discern to be empty, but struck across the marsh in the direction of the Nore. My first impulse was to call up Herbert and show him the 2 men going away, but, reflecting before I got into his room, which was at the back of the house and adjoined mine, that he and Startup had had a harder day than I, and were fatigued, I forbore. Going back to my window, I could see the 2 men moving over the marsh. In that light, however, I soon lost them, and feeling very cold, lay down to think of the matter, and fell asleep again. We were up early. As we walked to and fro, all 4 together, before breakfast, I deemed it right to recount what I had seen. Again our charge was the least anxious of the party. It was very likely that the men belonged to the Custom House, he said quietly, and that they had no thought of us. I tried to persuade myself that it was so, as indeed it might easily be. However, I proposed that he and I should walk away together to a distant point we could see, and that the boat should take us aboard there, or as near there as might prove feasible, at about noon. This being considered a good precaution, soon after breakfast he and I set forth, without saying anything at the tavern. He smoked his pipe as we went along, and sometimes stopped to clap me on the shoulder. One would have supposed that it was I who was in danger, not he, and that he was reassuring me. We spoke very little. As we approached the point, I begged him to remain in a sheltered place, while I went on to reconnoitre, for it was towards it that the men had passed in the night. He complied, and I went on alone. There was no boat off the point, nor any boat drawn up anywhere near it, nor were there any signs of the men having embarked there. But, to be sure, the tide was high, and there might have been some footprints under water. When he looked out from his shelter in the distance, and saw that I waved my hat to him to come up, he rejoined me, and there we waited, sometimes lying on the bank wrapped in our coats, and sometimes moving about to warm ourselves, until we saw our boat coming round. We got aboard easily, and rowed out into the track of the steamer. By that time it wanted but 10 minutes of 1 o'clock, and we began to look out for her smoke. But it was 1:30 before we saw her smoke, and soon afterwards we saw behind it the smoke of another steamer. As they were coming on at full speed, we got the 2 bags ready, and took that opportunity of saying good-bye to Herbert and Startup. We had all shaken hands cordially, and neither Herbert's eyes nor mine were quite dry, when I saw a 4-oared galley shoot out from under the bank, but a little way ahead of us, and row out into the same track. A stretch of shore had been as yet between us and the steamer's smoke, by reason of the bend and wind of the river, but now she was visible, coming head on. I called to Herbert and Startup to keep before the tide, that she might see us lying by for her, and I adjured Provis to sit quite still, wrapped in his cloak. He answered cheerily, "Trust to me, dear boy," and sat like a statue. Meantime the galley, which was very skilfully handled, had crossed us, let us come up with her, and fallen alongside. Leaving just room enough for the play of the oars, she kept alongside, drifting when we drifted, and pulling a stroke or 2 when we pulled. Of the 2 sitters, one held the rudder lines, and looked at us attentively, as did all the rowers. The other sitter was wrapped up, much as Provis was, and seemed to shrink, and whisper some instruction to the steerer as he looked at us. Not a word was spoken in either boat. Startup could make out, after a few minutes, which steamer was first, and gave me the word "Hamburg," in a low voice, as we sat face to face. She was nearing us very fast, and the beating of her pedals grew louder and louder. I felt as if her shadow were absolutely upon us, when the galley hailed us. I answered.
"You have a return transport there," said the man who held the lines. "That's the man, wrapped in the cloak. His name is Abel Magwitch, otherwise Provis. I apprehend that man, and call upon him to surrender, and you to assist."
At the same moment, without giving any audible direction to his crew, he ran the galley abroad of us. They had pulled one sudden stroke ahead, had got their oars in, had run athwart us, and were holding on to our gunwale before we knew what they were doing. This caused great confusion on board the steamer, and I heard them calling to us, and heard the order given to stop the paddles, and heard them stop, but felt her driving down upon us irresistibly. In the same moment, I saw the steersman of the galley lay his hand on his prisoner's shoulder, and saw that both boats were swinging round with the force of the tide, and saw that all hands on board the steamer were running forward quite frantically. Still in the same moment, I saw the prisoner start up, lean across his captor, and pull the cloak from the neck of the shrinking sitter in the galley. Still in the same moment, I saw that the face disclosed was the face of the other convict of long ago. Still in the same moment, I saw the face tilt backward with white terror on it that I shall never forget, and hear a great cry on board the steamer, and a loud splash in the water, and felt the boat sink from under me. It was but for an instant that I seemed to struggle with 1,000 mill-weirs and 1,000 flashes of light. That instant past, I was taken on board the galley. Herbert was there, and Startup was there, but our boat was gone, and the 2 convicts were gone. What with the cries aboard the steamer, and the furious blowing off of her steam, and her driving on, and our driving on, I could not at first distinguish sky from water, or shore from shore. But the crew of the galley righted her with great speed, and, pulling certain swift strong strokes ahead, lay upon their oars, every man looking silently and eagerly at the water astern. Presently a dark object was seen in it, bearing towards us on the tide. No man spoke, but the steersman held up his hand, and all softly backed water, and kept the boat straight and true before it. As it came nearer, I saw it to be Magwitch, swimming, but not swimming freely. He was taken on board, and instantly manacled at the wrists and ankles. The galley was kept steady, and the silent eager look-out at the water was resumed. But the Rotterdam steamer now came up, and apparently not understanding what had happened, came on at speed. By the time she had been hailed and stopped, both steamers were drifting away from us, and we were rising and falling in a troubled wake of water. The look-out was kept, long after all was still again, and the two steamers were gone, but everybody knew that it was hopeless now. At length we gave it up, and pulled under the shore towards the tavern we had lately left, where we were received with no little surprise. Here I was able to get some comforts for Magwitch, Provis no longer, who had received some very severe injury in the chest, and a deep cut in the head. He told me that he believed himself to have gone under the keel of the steamer, and to have been struck on the head in rising. The injury to his chest, which rendered his breathing extremely painful, he thought he had received against the side of the galley. He added that he did not pretend to say what he might or might not have done to Compeyson, but that in the moment of his laying his hand on his cloak to identify him, that villain had staggered up and staggered back, and they had both gone overboard together, when the sudden wrenching of him, Magwitch, out of our boat, and the endeavour of his captor to keep him in it, had capsized us. He told me in a whisper that they had gone down, fiercely locked in each other's arms, and that there had been a struggle under water, and that he had disengaged himself, struck out, and swum away. I never had any reason to doubt the exact truth of what he thus told me. The officer who steered the galley gave the same account of their going overboard. When I asked this officer's permission to change the prisoner's wet clothes by purchasing any spare garments I could get at the public-house, he gave it readily, merely observing that he must take charge of everything his prisoner had about him. So the pocket-book, which had once been in my hands, passed into the officer's. He further gave me leave to accompany the prisoner to London, but declined to accord that grace to my two friends. The Jack at the ship was instructed where the drowned man had gone down, and undertook to search for the body in the places where it was likeliest to come ashore. His interest in its recovery seemed to me to be much heightened when he heard that it had stockings on. Probably it took about a dozen drowned men to fit him out completely, and that may have been the reason why the different articles of his dress were in various stages of decay. We remained at the public-house until the tide turned, and then Magwitch was carried down to the galley and put on board. Herbert and Startup were to get to London by land as soon as they could. We had a doleful parting, and when I took my place by Magwitch's side, I felt that that was my place henceforth, while he lived. For now my repugnance to him had all melted away, and in the hunted, wounded, shackled creature who held my hand in his, I only saw a man who had meant to be my benefactor, and who had felt affectionately grateful and generously towards me with great constancy through a series of years. I only saw in him a much better man than I had been to Joe. His breathing became more difficult and painful as the night drew on, and often he could not repress a groan. I tried to rest him on the arm I could use, in any easy position, but it was dreadful to think that I could not be sorry at heart for his being badly hurt, since it was unquestionably best that he should die. That there were, still living, people enough who were able and willing to identify him, I could not doubt. That he would be leniently treated, I could not hope. He who had been presented in the worst light at his trial, who had since broken prison, and had been tried again, who had returned from transportation under a life sentence, and who had occasioned the death of the man who was the cause of his arrest. As we returned towards the setting sun we had yesterday left behind us, and as the stream of our hopes seemed all running back, I told him how grieved I was to think that he had come home for my sake.
"Dear boy," he answered, "I'm quite content to take my chance. I've seen my boy, and he can be a gentleman without me."
No. I had thought about that, while we had been there side by side. No. Apart from any inclinations of my own, I understood Wemmick's hint now. I foresaw that, being convicted, his possessions would be forfeited to the Crown.
"Look'ee here, dear boy," said he, "it's best as a gentleman should not be knowed to belong to me now. Only come to see me as if you come by chance along of Wemmick. Sit where I can see you, when I'm swore to, for the last of many times, and I don't ask no more."
"I will never stir from your side," said I, "when I am suffered to be near you. Please God, I will be as true to you as you have been to me." I felt his hand tremble as it held mine, and he turned his face away as he lay in the bottom of the boat, and I heard that old sound in his throat, softened now, like all the rest of him. It was a good thing that he had touched this point, for it put into my mind what I might not otherwise have thought of until too late, that he need never know how his hopes of enriching me had perished. Chapter 54. Chapter 55. He was taken to the police court next day, and would have been immediately committed for trial, but that it was necessary to send down for an old officer of the prison ship, from which he had once escaped, to speak to his identity. Nobody doubted it, but Compeyson, who had meant to depose to it, was tumbling on the tides, dead, and it happened that there was not at that time any prison officer in London who could give the required evidence. I had gone direct to Mr. Jaggers at his private house, on my arrival overnight, to retain his assistance, and Mr. Jaggers, on the prisoner's behalf, would admit nothing. It was the sole resource, for he told me that the case must be over in 5 minutes when the witness was there, and that no power on earth could prevent its going against us. I imparted to Mr. Jaggers my design of keeping him in ignorance of the fate of his wealth. Mr. Jaggers was querulous and angry with me for having let it slip through my fingers, and said we must memorialize by and by, and try at all events for some of it. But he did not conceal from me that although there might be many cases in which the forfeiture would not be exacted, there were no circumstances in this case to make it one of them. I understood that very well. I was not related to the outlaw, or connected with him by any recognizable tie. He had put his hand to no writing or settlement in my favour before his apprehension, and to do so now would be idle. I had no claim, and I finally resolved, and ever afterwards abided by the resolution, that my heart should never be sickened with the hopeless task of attempting to establish one. There appeared to be reason for supposing that the drowned informer had hoped for a reward out of this forfeiture, and had obtained some accurate knowledge of Magwitch's affairs. When his body was found, many miles from the scene of his death, and so horribly disfigured that he was only recognizable by the contents of his pockets, notes were still legible, folded in a case he carried. Among these were the name of a banking house in New South Wales, where a sum of money was, and the designation of certain lands of considerable value. Both these heads of information were in a list that Magwitch, while in prison, gave to Mr. Jaggers, of the possessions he supposed I should inherit. His ignorance, poor fellow, at last served him. He never mistrusted but that my inheritance was quite safe, with Mr. Jaggers's aid. After 3 days' delay, during which the Crown Prosecution stood over the production of the witness from the prison ship. The witness came, and completed the easy case. He was committed to take his trial at the next sessions, which would come on in a month. It was at this dark time of my life that Herbert returned home one evening, a good deal cast down, and said, "My dear Handel, I fear I shall soon have to leave you." His partner having prepared me for that, I was less surprised than he thought. "We shall lose a fine opportunity if I put off going to Cairo, and I'm very much afraid I must go, Handel, when you most need me." "Herbert, I shall always need you, because I shall always love you. But my need is no greater now than at another time." "You will be so lonely." "I have not leisure to think of that," said I. "You know that I am always with him, to the full extent of the time allowed, and that I should be with him all day long if I could. And when I come away from him, you know that my thoughts are with him." The dreadful condition to which he was brought was so appalling to both of us, that we could not refer to it in plainer words. "My dear fellow," said Herbert, "let the near prospect of our separation, for it is very near, be my justification for troubling you about yourself. Have you thought of your future?" "No, for I have been afraid to think of any future." "But yours cannot be dismissed." "Indeed, my dear, dear Handel, it must not be dismissed. I wish you would enter on it now, as far as a few friendly words go, with me." "I will," said I. "In this branch house of ours, Handel, we must have a—" I saw that his delicacy was avoiding the right word, so I said, "a clerk." "A clerk, and I hope it is not at all unlikely that he may expand, as a clerk of your acquaintance has expanded, into a partner. Now, Handel, in short, my dear boy, will you come to me?" There was something charmingly cordial and engaging in the manner in which, after saying, "Now, Handel," as if it were the grave beginning of a portentous business exordium, he had suddenly given up that tone, stretched out his honest hand, and spoke like a schoolboy. "Clara and I have talked about it again and again," Herbert pursued, "and the dear little thing begged me only this evening, with tears in her eyes, to say to you that if you will live with us when we come together, she will do her best to make you happy, and to convince her husband's friend that he is her friend too. We should get on so well, Handel." I thanked her heartily, and I thanked him heartily, but said I could not yet make sure of joining him, as he so kindly offered. Firstly, my mind was too preoccupied to be able to take in the subject clearly. Secondly, there was a vague something lingering in my thoughts that will come out very near the end of this slight narrative. "But if you thought, Herbert, that you could, without doing any injury to your business, leave the question open for a little while—" "For any while," cried Herbert. "6 months, a year?" "Not so long as that," said I. 2 or 3 months at most." Herbert was highly delighted when we shook hands on this arrangement, and said he could now take courage to tell me that he believed he must go away at the end of the week. "And Clara?" said I. "The dear little thing," returned Herbert, "holds dutifully to her father as long as he lasts, but he won't last long. Mrs. Whimple confides to me that he is certainly going." "Not to say an unfeeling thing," said I, "he cannot do better than go." "I am afraid that must be admitted," said Herbert, "and then I shall come back for the dear little thing, and the dear little thing and I will walk quietly into the nearest church. Remember, the blessed darling comes of no family, my dear Handel, and never looked into the red book, and hasn't a notion about her grandpapa. What a fortune for the son of my mother!" On the Saturday in that same week, I took my leave of Herbert, full of bright hope, but sad and sorry to leave me, as he sat on one of the seaport mail coaches. I went into a coffee-house to write a little note to Clara, telling her he had gone off, sending his love to her over and over again, and then went to my lonely home, if it deserved the name, for it was now no home to me, and I had no home anywhere. On the stairs I encountered Wemmick, who was coming down after an unsuccessful application of his knuckles to my door. I had not seen him alone since the disastrous issue of the attempted flight, and he had come in his private and personal capacity to say a few words of explanation in reference to that failure.
"The late Compeyson," said Wemmick, "had by little and little got to the bottom of half of the regular business now transacted, and it was from the talk of some of his people in trouble, some of his people being always in trouble, that I heard what I did. I kept my ears open, seeming to have them shut, until I heard that he was absent, and I thought that would be the best time for making the attempt. I can only suppose now that it was a part of his policy, as a very clever man, habitually to deceive his own instruments. You don't blame me, I hope, Mr. Pip? I'm sure I tried to serve you with all my heart."
"I am as sure of that, Wemmick, as you can be, and I thank you most earnestly for all your interest and friendship."
"Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a bad job," said Wemmick, scratching his head, "and I assure you I haven't been so cut up for a long time. What I look at is the sacrifice of so much portable property. Oh, dear me!"
"What I think of, Wemmick, is the poor owner of the property."
"Yes, to be sure," said Wemmick. "Of course there can be no objection to your being sorry for him, and I'd put down a £5 note myself to get him out of it. But what I look at is this. The late Compeyson, having been beforehand with him in intelligence of his return, and being so determined to bring him to book, I do not think he could have been saved, whereas the portable property certainly could have been saved. That's the difference between the property and the owner, don't you see?"
I invited Wemmick to come upstairs and refresh himself with a glass of grog before walking to Walworth. He accepted the invitation. While he was drinking his moderate allowance, he said, with nothing leading up to it, and after having appeared rather fidgety,
"What do you think of my meaning to take a holiday on Monday, Mr. Pip?"
"Why, I suppose you have not done such a thing these 12 months?"
"These 12 years, more likely," said Wemmick. "Yes, I'm going to take a holiday. More than that, I'm going to take a walk. More than that, I'm going to ask you to take a walk with me."
I was about to excuse myself, as being but a bad companion just then, when Wemmick anticipated me.
"I know your engagements," said he, "and I know you're out of sorts, Mr. Pip; but if you could oblige me, I should take it as a kindness. It ain't a long walk, and it's an early one. Say it might occupy you, including breakfast on the walk, from 8 to 12. Couldn't you stretch a point and manage it?"
He had done so much for me at various times, that this was very little to do for him. I said I could manage it, would manage it, and he was so very much pleased by my acquiescence that I was pleased too. At his particular request, I appointed to call for him at the castle at 8:30 on Monday morning, and so we parted for the time. Punctual to my appointment, I rang at the castle gate on the Monday morning, and was received by Wemmick himself, who struck me as looking tighter than usual, and having a sleeker hat on. Within, there were 2 glasses of rum and milk prepared, and 2 biscuits. The aged must have been stirring with the lark, for, glancing into the perspective of his bedroom, I observed that his bed was empty. When we had fortified ourselves with the rum and milk and biscuits, and were going out for the walk, with that training preparation on us, I was considerably surprised to see Wemmick take up a fishing rod, and put it over his shoulder. "Why, we are not going fishing," said I. "No," returned Wemmick, "but I like to walk with one." I thought this odd. However, I said nothing, and we set off. We went towards Camberwell Green, and when we were thereabouts, Wemmick said suddenly, "Hello! Here's a church." There was nothing very surprising in that, but again I was rather surprised when he said, as if he were animated by a brilliant idea, "Let's go in." We went in, Wemmick leaving his fishing-rod in the porch, and looked all round. In the meantime, Wemmick was diving into his coat pockets, and getting something out of paper there.
"Hello!" said he. "Here's a couple of pair of gloves. Let's put 'em on."
As the gloves were white kid gloves, and as the post office was widened to its utmost extent, I now began to have my strong suspicions. They were strengthened into certainty when I beheld the aged enter at a side door, escorting a lady.
"Hello!" said Wemmick. "Here's Miss Skiffins. Let's have a wedding."
That discreet damsel was attired as usual, except that she was now engaged in substituting for her green kid gloves a pair of white. The aged was likewise occupied in preparing a similar sacrifice for the altar of Hymen. The old gentleman, however, experienced so much difficulty in getting his gloves on, that Wemmick found it necessary to put him with his back against a pillar, and then to get behind the pillar himself, and pull away at them, while I, for my part, held the old gentleman round the waist, that he might present an equal and safe resistance. By dint of this ingenious scheme, his gloves were got on to perfection. The clerk and clergyman then appearing, we arranged in order at those fatal rails. True to his notion of seeming to do it all without preparation, I heard Wemmick say to himself, as he took something out of his waistcoat pocket before the service began, "Hello! Here's a ring." I acted in the capacity of backer, or best man, to the bridegroom, while a little limp pew-opener, in a soft bonnet like a baby's, made a feint of being the bosom friend of Miss Skiffins. The responsibility of giving the lady away devolved upon the aged, which led to the clergyman's being unintentionally scandalized, and it happened thus. When he said, "Who giveth this woman to be married to this man?" the old gentleman, not in the least knowing what point of the ceremony we had arrived at, stood most amiably beaming at the 10 Commandments. Upon which the clergyman said again, "Who giveth this woman to be married to this man?" The old gentleman being still in a state of most estimable unconsciousness, the bridegroom cried out in his accustomed voice, "Now, aged P., you know who giveth." To which the aged replied with great briskness, before saying that he gave, "All right, John, all right, my boy." And the clergyman came to so gloomy a pause upon it, that I had doubts for the moment whether we should get completely married that day. It was completely done, however, and when we were going out of church, Wemmick took the cover off the font, and put his white gloves in it, and put the cover on again. Mrs. Wemmick, more heedful of the future, put her white gloves in her pocket, and assumed her green. "Now, Mr. Pip," said Wemmick, triumphantly shouldering the fishing-rod as we came out, "let me ask you whether anybody would suppose this to be a wedding party?" Breakfast had been ordered at a pleasant little tavern, a mile or so away, upon the rising ground beyond the green, and there was a bagatelle board in the room, in case we should desire to unbend our minds after the solemnity. It was pleasant to observe that Mrs. Wemmick no longer unwound Wemmick's arm when it adapted itself to her figure, but sat in a high-backed chair against the wall, like a violoncello in its case, and submitted to be embraced as that melodious instrument might have done. We had an excellent breakfast, and when any one declined anything on the table, Wemmick said, "Provided by contract, you know. Don't be afraid of it." I drank to the new couple, drank to the aged, drank to the castle, saluted the bride at parting, and made myself as agreeable as I could. Wemmick came down to the door with me, and I again shook hands with him, and wished him joy. "Thank'ee," said Wemmick, rubbing his hands. "She's such a manager of fowls, you have no idea. You shall have some eggs, and judge for yourself. I say, Mr. Pip," calling me back and speaking low, "this is altogether a war with sentiment, please." "I understand. Not to be mentioned in Little Britain," said I. Wemmick nodded. "After what you let out the other day, Mr. Jaggers may as well not know of it. He might think my brain was softening, or something of the kind." Chapter 55.